Well, so I guess I'm supposed to begin with talking about how my research began and sort of where it's ended up. When I was starting this class, in our first couple of weeks, I had sort of an unusual problem. I guess I had too many ideas. I wasn't quite sure which idea I liked the best, which one I really wanted to spend a lot of time researching. I had a couple of them. One of them was looking at what has caused sort of some of the issues in the salmon population that we're having around here within recent years. Another one was looking at how the politics of Europe during the time of the Reformation shaped the Reformation. Looking at the curious nature of Moroccan Arabic and why it is the way it is. I've been very interested by languages, wanted to look at that, but unfortunately there just wasn't any resources available to me for that one. Otherwise I may have done that one. It may have been a mess, such a big project. It's probably more one that I'd have to spend a couple of years actually looking at. Well, then this one was sort of interesting because I had read an article one time. It was just sort of very brief, sort of simple, quick article, which was essentially saying that we can, when we look back on the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, they were simply attempting to argue that coffee was the reason for it happening. And that was sort of interesting to me, and eventually I decided to start looking into that, simply because it was so this interesting little thing. You know, it sort of involves coffee, which is still a major thing today, and this very fascinating time in the socio-political history of Europe. And as my research went on, it became more and more obvious that, I mean, as with most things in history, one thing isn't always the result of one other thing. The Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason wasn't because coffee was introduced to Europe and because people stopped drinking beer and were drinking coffee and all of a sudden weren't drunk all the time but were just hyped up on caffeine. It was a variety of different things. For example, and I ended up looking more and more into specifically English coffee houses and the social political effect that coffee had on London, England. And what I kind of found was that within England, and especially in London and Oxford, the introduction of coffee and coffee houses led to and fostered this area within the community which was very centered around critical discussion and critical thought. And of course it was partly because of the reason I said earlier, that because people weren't always spending their day at the tavern drinking beer, instead they were now drinking coffee and were sort of hyped up on caffeine. But it was more because of coffee was, in its early introduction to England, quickly adopted by the intellectually curious. There was sort of this bohemian social sphere of 17th century England called themselves the virtuosi. And they were sort of these intellectually curious guys who would go traveling around the world and bring back stories to England with all of these newfound inventions and plants and arts and stuff, and they would just discuss it. And coffee was very quickly adopted by the virtuosi. And so once the first English coffee house, which was established in Oxford, was established there, it quickly became a favorite haunting ground of the Oxford scholars, partly because it was this new scientific culinary curiosity that so many people, well, not so many, that members of the academically curious community had heard of. This new weird drink coming out of the Mideast called kofa, coming from some Ethiopian cherry, and also the virtuosi community around Oxford and the academically curious community of England, which was had already begun adopting this drink into their own little society. When coffee was first introduced to London, it actually kind of took a little while for it to really catch on, even though it had really sort of a niche market. It was popular in Oxford because Oxford was sort of a smaller place, very academically centered, very scholarly, and so the academically curious and the scholarly quickly took to it. Partly for taste, partly for just its curiosity. In London, it was much more of a niche market. Really only expats from the Near East, from Turkey, Egypt, and the rest in Arabia would probably be the only ones who would regularly frequent them, and maybe some of the members of the virtuosi and academically curious within London. Sort of a turning point for it was there was this sort of intellectual society formed by a man named Harrington called the Rota, and they met nearly daily at this one coffee shop called Miles Coffee House, and they would get together all the time, and it was for the purpose of their own debate and discussion and critical discourse, because this was during the time of the English Protectorate, so Oliver Cromwell has overthrown the monarchy, set himself up as Lord Protector, and these men were some of the followers of Cromwell, and they would get together and discuss political philosophy, new ideas that were coming into London, and also just a little bit of current events. Their group shut down, however. They sort of disbanded shortly before Charles II was about to be reinstated as monarch, because Cromwell had kind of beheaded Charles' father, which wouldn't have been very good for them. A group of former traitors meeting together regularly to discuss Cromwellian political philosophy wouldn't be very good for them. But that was sort of a turning point within coffee and coffee house society in London. And the memory of the Rota Club stayed around for a while. And coffee houses began to be associated with this idea of intellectual discourse and academic discourse. And the coffee houses were very conducive to it. You had to just pay the price of a penny to get in and get your cup of coffee, and then you could sit down, and all of these papers and pamphlets and the news of the current day was always flowing through the coffee houses. The coffee houses were the main source of newspaper revenue, and that's where the news flowed out of, and that's where discourse and discussion happened because everybody was drinking so much caffeine. They were sort of waking from this perpetual drunken fog where they drank watered down ale because that was the only thing that they could drink, because the water from the Thames wasn't healthy from morning to night. And it just sort of saw this very fascinating boom all of a sudden within London, and that lasted for about a century. And coffee was especially popular among the Whigs, who were a political ideology in from that area of of English history, who were sort of followers in the same vein of John Locke and his classically liberal political philosophy. Some other prominent Whigs were the economist Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, and at the time, as with there was the Tories and the Whigs, and tea was for Tories, who were the loyalists to the crown, and coffee was for Whigs. That's sort of how it just sort of happened for one way or another. Each political ideology is just sort of chose a drink which they would all sort of center around. And I would think that's probably partly because of that memory that was still there from the Rota Club, and Harrington and Cromwell's men and all of them getting together to discuss these Republicanist ideas, which were sort of a precursor, sort of offshoot from the Whigs, it seems. And a lot of the coffee houses also became centers of Whiggish thought through the papers and the pamphlets. A couple of the old 17th century pamphleteers and papers such as the Spectator and the Guardian and the Times, they were all Whiggish papers and were circulated throughout London through the coffee houses. That's where men would get together and they'd just pop in, get a coffee and read the paper, and then they'd lean over to the guy next to them and say, hey, look at this. And then a discussion would start. One interesting thing about the coffee house is that there's a German sociologist, his name is Jürgen Habermas, and he noted that the emergence of the coffee house in 17th century and 18th century English society marked the emergence of a new sort of social concept, which was the public sphere. And this was the sphere of public interaction outside of the sphere of government, the sphere of the church, and the sphere of the domestic life. And this was where people simply interact outside of the state, outside of the church, outside of the home. The emergence of the coffee shop represented sort of the emergence of this public sphere, and was especially representative of this new sort of curious emergence of the public sphere, in that the public sphere as a center of a public forum of discourse and discussion. And the interesting thing about it was that it was very curiously, well, there are a couple of different interesting things about it. Habermas said a couple of the criteria for the public sphere were egalitarianism, sociability. I can't remember the second one. But I mean, in a way, the coffee houses were egalitarian. Any man could come in to the coffee shop for the price of a penny, and I mean, you would have the dock worker sitting beside the scholar, sitting beside the news writer, sitting beside the author, and you had this mixing now of classes. They weren't egalitarian in the sense of the genders. It was still a very much male-dominated area of society. But you had this new sort of novel interaction between the classes coming together and discussions emerging because of that. And also, it's sort of this interesting parallel between, I mean, you think sort of the cliche of the aspiring writer or screenwriter just going to the coffee shop all day long, just chugging down espresso while writing their book or their screenplay. But that's been the same thing ever since coffee houses been around. Authors would get together and spend the day at the coffee shop writing up new stories and discussing each other's works. In fact, there was a club that met regularly where they would read each other's works and celebrate each other's works, or tear apart each other's works depending on the quality of it. An interesting bit was the coffee house. An interesting little side note about artists and coffee houses was. The coffee house was a phenomenon that happened across Europe, and in Germany, Johann Sebastian Bach, the Baroque composer, would spend a lot of time in coffee houses and would sometimes write pieces there. And he one time wrote, just for fun, this little piece called the Kaffeekantate. which it's a short story, musical story revolving around this young woman who's betrothed to be married, and then, but she can't be found on the day of her wedding, and her father finds her there at the coffee house, and she's like, what? And he's like, what are you doing? And she's like, well, I can't get married because I'm too much in love with coffee, and my husband doesn't like them drinking coffee. In the end, it all has a happy ending. I can't remember it, but it's just sort of, she's so deeply in love with her coffee, she can't make any room for anything else, I guess, or something like that. I guess, yeah, let me see what else I have to talk about here. But my topics really changed a lot over the course of this project. I was looking at originally the way, I mean, the original idea was looking at the Enlightenment and coffee. But that changed to look at how did coffee affect my research question was something along the lines of how did the introduction of coffee to European society affect it? Or in what way was European society influenced by it? And then that got narrowed to London. And it wasn't as much looking at, I'm not quite sure if it was as much looking at it, but more well, I guess I am looking at the way in which the introduction of coffee influenced London society. Has it changed? I think it has changed a lot. Not as much in the idea, but more in the form. I'm now looking at the way in which the introduction of coffee to London influenced the spread of ideas and influenced this new idea of the public form of discourse and how that came about because of it. So it's gotten more refined, of course. I guess I have to provide some rationale for my research. You know, it's sort of curious, and I mean, really, I have a bit of an expositor. My essay is really sort of analytically expository, explaining and looking at the history of something. And I would think that that's important because, I mean, history is always important. It's always important to know about the history of things and ideas and how society has changed, and also understand context. Throughout my research, I've come to appreciate a bit more some of my favorite coffee shops here around town, just sort of how they're continuing this long-standing tradition of this forum of public discourse in the form of the modern coffee shop, where people are always still getting together, engaging in discussion and discourse, looking at the news, or looking at creating art, or discussing art, or just discussing life. I mean, not all coffee houses were these centers of great critical discourse. Sometimes friends would just get together at the coffee shop and talk about life, which isn't better or worse than critical discussion because it's a part of life, and the modern coffee shops are continuing that tradition. So I think it's important to understand history and to understand context and then understand tradition. This understanding can give us better appreciation of ideas and context and places and things. So I think that that's an important reason for this research. So that's what I'll say by my rationale for it. What would I do if I had a year or two to devote to this research? Oh man. I would... I mean... this paper is really just barely scratching the surface of the influence upon coffee on not only London and English society, but upon European society as a whole. There's so many different... Europe is such a socially and historically diverse little continent, and there's so much that happens over just a couple hundred years, and the introduction of coffee was there through it all, and you have the French salons and the saloniers and the German coffee shops and the Danish coffee shops and the Turks in Istanbul, and there's just so much that happens, and each one, and even just this paper is really, like I just said, just barely scratching the surface of even just London coffee house culture. And there's so much more that you can look so in depth about into the political nature of the coffee houses, into the social nature of the coffee house, into the health. I mean, you could look at the ways in which coffee maybe affected the health of Londoners, whether or not there's that any records or evidence for that, which exists. I guess that's something else, you know. But that's something that you can find out in research, you know. So I guess if I had a year or two devoted to this research, I mean, I'd probably write a book about it. And it would probably be a big book. I'd probably write a couple books about it. I mean, it would take a long time, longer than a year or two. So I guess I'd have to, if I just had a year or two, I'd write a really big, long thesis about, you know, I'm not quite sure what it would be about within that. That's something I guess I'd have to figure out in the process of doing it. But if I just had a year or two of doing it, I'd probably write a book-long paper. If I had longer, oh man, that would take a while, let me tell you that. Because this has been fun. I guess that's all of really the questions that I needed to answer. I guess just sort of as an ending, this class has been really enjoyable. So it's just all my classmates, especially with Candace. It's just been so fun to see everybody else's papers evolve and change over time. I wish you all luck on the rest of your work, rest of your writing and revisions. Until next time.